back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitriy Kalygin here with episode 170 of World War Now with this week's World War III analysis. A huge amount of things have happened once again here on this Friday night. As this is being recorded, we are on the brink of the potential collapse of the Memorandum of Understanding. The Iranians and the United States have exchanged fire in the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians are attempting to keep the strait closed. The Omanis are getting caught in the middle of this as many ships are trying to hug the Omani side of the strait and get past the closure, and the IRGC has issued warnings, launched drones. The Americans have responded. It seems that both sides are still interested in keeping the negotiations and the Memorandum of Understanding alive. J.D. Vance is trying to salvage the deal as well. We are seeing what could be a J.D. Vance-Marco Rubio split emerge with, J.D. Vance obviously trying to take credit for this ceasefire and this potential deal. So Marco Rubio potentially trying to squander it himself. He was at the Gulf Council meeting with all the Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, all of these countries, where he said, no, we demand freedom of navigation through the straits, no tolls, no fees to be charged by the Iranians or the Omanis. So that is the major sticking point right now. The Iranians are basically trying to control the strait, and the Americans are very much resisting that. We're, of course, going to talk about the situation in Lebanon, which might be the hot focal point right now. The Americans, Israelis, and Lebanese negotiating team, Joseph Aoun and these clownish characters, they have announced a deal, a 14-point deal that is going into effect apparently very soon, that will disarm Hezbollah and see Israel withdraw. Hezbollah has already responded saying that they reject this deal entirely and a civil war will be needed to enforce it. So as we speak, clashes in the streets of Beirut and Dahieh are taking place, with pro-resistance factions clashing with Lebanese armed forces. So big updates there. We might see a new Israeli-facilitated Lebanese civil war. So many other regional updates. Israel is against Turkey's purchase of the American F-35s, which has been in the works for a long time. They're so against this that they are now rushing Israeli recognition of the Armenian genocide through the Knesset, trying to get that all the way through. So we're going to be discussing all of that and so much more. The situation in Russia, as more and more people are getting frustrated with Russia's lack of advancement and the stalemate that is the Russia-Ukraine war. Marco Rubio is coming out and openly saying there was no Washington deal, or rather there was no Alaska Anchorage deal between Moscow and Washington. So at this point, what even is happening? Why are we not going all out against the Kiev regime, I think, is the question that a lot of people are asking. So we're going to be discussing all of this, so much more, many other stories, the earthquake in Venezuela, which has killed many people. There's a lot to discuss this week. So I'll do the plugs in a second, but thank you so much for joining me. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. It's another week of broken trust internationally, of broken relations. Really, we are pretty much on the deathbed of common sense international relations, well, as the world called them, the so-called relations between nation states in the post-World War II world order. They are falling apart very truly. And I think the Middle East and Eastern Europe is basically the cemetery where these particular ideas will go to die. But this week, I think, is evidence speaking to that. And I think we're on the brink of even more catastrophe. It's very sad, especially given the Middle East has been wanting peace for so long, but Israel will just not allow it.
No, like I've said, I thought that we might make it to late August or September until the fighting kicks off again with, the U.S. and other parties wanting to make it past the World Cup and the 250th anniversary and these other things. But, we might not even make it to the end of June before things really kick off again. And we have to remember that Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei is, he expressed his difference of opinion that he had towards the MoU as opposed to Ghalibaf, Aragchi, Pezeshki, and the more moderates that are trying to lead these negotiations. So the Supreme Leader seems prepared at any moment to return to fighting. So I don't think it's 100% assured that the Iranians are going to grit their teeth and take it. Because as of right now, the IRGC released a statement saying that they retaliated to these U.S. strikes on Sirik Island and Bandar Abbas, which apparently were in retaliation to these drones that were launched at these tankers that were passing through the Omani side of the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans had announced that there was freedom of navigation going through there. In response to all of this, J.D. Vance has said that Iran signed a ceasefire agreement. We have honored it. If they have disagreements about how the MoU is being applied, they can pick up the phone, but violence will be met with violence. So that is the U.S. response. It appears the Iranians either didn't respond or there has been no publicization of what targets they struck. They claimed to have struck U.S. targets in the region. The statement says following the Zionist regime's violation of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon. A few hours ago, the treaty-breaking American regime also, as always, violated its commitments under various pretexts related to the movement of a violating ship through an unauthorized route in the Strait of Hormuz. It launched an air attack on the coast of Iran. In response to this aggression, the IRGC Navy struck the U.S. Army positions in the region. According to Clause 5 of the Islamabad MoU, the arrangements for controlling passage and traffic in the Strait of Hormuz are under the authority of the Islamic Republic of Iran. However, America, by provoking various sides, sought to violate this commitment, and the necessary response was given. From now on, it will be the same. If the aggression is repeated, our response will be broader than this. And I don't know what that response was. So that is the current status. I don't know if we're going to get updates on that or if there will be more exchanges of fire, but it seems that obviously J.D. Vance is trying to keep the deal alive. I think Pezeshkian obviously is going to be committed to keeping the deal alive. He's the only one that's on camera signing it. Of course, Ghalibaf is also, and Araghchi are also major parts of that coalition. Earlier this week, of course, Iran informed the U.S. Through the newly established Hormuz deconfliction communication channel that it had bombed another tanker. That was yesterday. The American side reportedly exclaimed, "What the F, man? What do you mean?" upon hearing the news. So apparently the tensions are they're very high right now in the strait. The traffic has not returned to normal levels. This is from HFI research as far as the flow goes. It says, as I noted yesterday, I was seeing a lot of vessels using the Oman route to exit. This was following the announcement by Oman and the IMO. The IRGC retaliated today on a vessel, but even after the attack, I'm still seeing transits. It's a lot less, but there are vessels willing to take the risk. On the inbound front, the flow is still heavily restricted. Whatever outflow we are seeing today is unsustainable as there are not enough non-Iranian tankers going in. In particular, we see empty VLCCs going in to load up crude. This is just a trickle so far. In my view, the traffic in the Oman lane will lead to more escalation by IRGC. Without throttling flows entirely in the southern lane, IRGC will lose control of its leverage over the strait. If they act, then it's a question of what the U.S. does after. I think this is only the beginning, and that leaves us exactly where we are right now. Before we go, I got to encourage everybody to become a supporter of the show at worldwarnow.co. That is our Substack. We had a great subscriber Q&A this week, so if you want to listen to that, it will be linked down below. All of our paid subscribers got the opportunity to ask us whatever questions they wanted, and we answered in the form of an Ether Hour episode. So if you want to become one of those question askers, feel free to become a paid supporter. You get access not just to the Q&As, but you get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes, including recent interviews with former Defense Minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, who I've been texting today to figure out what's going on right now in Lebanon. So we'll get some updates on that very shortly, of course. But we also have episodes with Father Peter Heers, with former member of the European Parliament, Nick Griffin, with Mike Painovich, with all sorts of incredible guests. So be sure to check that out, become a paid supporter. It's what keeps this weekly World War III analysis free for everybody, and it's really the whole other side of our analysis. This is the news, and that is sort of the worldview and the history and the other perspectives that we bring with the guests and the questions and the other analysis that Dmitry and I bring to the table. So check all of that out at worldwarnow.co. Be sure to follow us on X at worldwarnow_ as well, and our great sponsor, Antelope Hill Publishing. Go to antelopehillpublishing.com and use code WWN for 10% off your order, whatever it is you're ordering, purchasing. Whether it's all sorts of things, whether it's some patches, books, other things on their site, antelopehillpublishing.com. Code WWN will get you 10% off. So use it to buy the latest edition of Culture of Critique from Kevin MacDonald, the 3rd edition. Use it to buy one of the George Washington Hezbollah patches that they have there on the front page at antelopehillpublishing.com. So do all of that. Check them out. Great supporters of the show. Again, there and worldwarnow.co are great ways to support the show. If you're already a paid supporter, be sure to donate on the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. Or if you don't want to become a paid supporter and just want to do a one-time payment towards us to show some support, that is a great way to do it as well. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Like the episode, please, whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, X, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, please give the show a like. Leave us a comment to let us know what you think. We like replying to the comments. So if you've got a perspective on the geopolitical scenario, please feel free to let us know and we will respond. So thank you all so much for tuning in. But back to the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. Again, as that analysis stated, the Americans are trying to, or rather us, I'm an American, of course, are trying to use the Omani side of the Strait of Hormuz to facilitate the free passage with no tolls. The Omanis, of course, have been sort of caught in the middle of this, not really knowing who to side with. And this is from Bonzer Berry. It says in the last 2 days, The U.S. has simultaneously attempted to undermine the MoU by coercing Oman into opening up their own route through the Strait of Hormuz and by favoring only a limited IOF withdrawal from Lebanon using their pilot zones. On top of that, it's still unclear whether the U.S. is serious about further impeding the flow of frozen funds. So again, even in this statement, obviously just an analyst, but the Iranians in their statement are also coupling, of course, the American violations in the Strait of Hormuz with the American sort of entertainment of Israel's complete refusal to withdraw from Lebanon. So that is the main sticking points as we expected, Lebanon and the Strait of Hormuz. We have a report here from Bloomberg. It says Oman has told European officials there's no way of going back to the pre-war status quo with the Strait of Hormuz, and transiting ships may have to be charged some fees. While Omani officials said they will always abide by international maritime law, they added there could be fees for services related to depolluting the strait or helping ships navigate it. It's unclear if Oman said all these fees would be obligatory. And of course, that's what Dmitry and I have been saying for weeks now, that the status quo in the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits established by Turkey, where they charge fees for environmental regulation, tugboats and navigation and other such things, those will be charged, and they're not exactly considered the same as a toll. So that is the current status in the Strait of Hormuz. Again, the Iranians are trying to maintain their control. The Omanis, as the latest update was that statement they made to European officials, the Omanis seem to be slightly, not entirely, but leaning towards the Iranian side of things in their attempt to control it jointly with them and the Persian Gulf Strait Authority that the IRGC established. So with all of that, before we talk anything about Lebanon, Dmitry, what are your thoughts on the Strait of Hormuz, the status of the memorandum of understanding and this tit for tat that's going on? I'm sort of confused by the Iranian response, mostly because I haven't seen it or know what it was, if it existed at all.
That's right. Not only is the Iranian response confusing because, we haven't seen any evidence of it, just as, frankly, we haven't seen really evidence of the U.S. bombing in late May, early June of the Iranians, because most of the bombing took place at nighttime, right? So the second wave of the Purim War really didn't witness it. And I think it's just a complete lockdown of communications allows pretty much only the IRGC spokespersons or, for example, the Foreign Ministry of Iran to actually give us any sort of coherent messaging from the inside of the state of Iran to. And look, we only receive really filtered messages, but I do want to know, like that particular commercial ship that Iran attacked, I think it was the Ever Lovely cargo ship. Like, what was the reasoning behind that? What were they suspecting was being transported on that particular boat? Was it hugging the Omani coast a bit too closely? Did it simply not pay those particular fees? Did it not listen to Iranian signaling, for example? And this is why the drone attacked it. But the other really surprising thing is not just a sort of slightly provocative strike of Iran on this particular cargo ship, but the fact that the US was very instantaneously ready to respond. And I'm not even sure if this ship was flying an American flag, for example, but I would imagine a disagreement from a commercial ship, maybe not replying to certain signals from the Iranian shore, would maybe not prompt such a response if the ship was flying an Iranian flag. So in a way, almost both sides are walking on a knife's edge. It's incredibly tense. Both sides are prepared, especially CENTCOM. Look, they have all their radars operational. No doubt the 82nd Airborne Division, the American paratroopers, thousands of them, right, still positioned somewhere in the GCC states at some secret location training. They're all prepared for Operation Karg Island or Operation Island of Keshem, or Operation Bandar Abbas or Operation Bushehr Peninsula. They're all prepared for some sort of drop-off point, especially accompanied by the Marine Expeditionary Units. And the American fleet is still there in the Sea of Arabia, just a few hundred kilometers, but of course, minutes of flight away from the targets in Iran or from the coastline. Because when CENTCOM responded to this Ever Lovely cargo ship, that's literally the name of the ship, being hit by Iran, their response was very, very quick. It was like within an hour perhaps. And allegedly they did strike Iranian targets. Iran pretty much confirmed it too for us because they literally said they responded. So the US is still pretty much ready, finger on the trigger. And the real question is who exactly has trigger control? Is it the Israelis? Is Netanyahu and his government? Are they still pretty much holding control over influence in the White House in order to have this conflict reignite? Or is this just Trump, Vance, and Marco Rubio not being able to maneuver around, the complex situation which they themselves unfortunately stepped into, right? Because the Iran at the moment is in an extremely tense and stressful state themselves. They've lost much of their leadership in the IRGC. There's a lot of replacement. A lot of new leaders, of course, have been given supreme executive positions in Iran, and they need to prove themselves, including in the IRGC. A lot of those generals have seen their literal, probably fathers in arms perish under the bombs of US and Israeli assaults over the last few months. I think they feel very, very strongly about any sort of US retaliation. So the situation really can deteriorate at any point. But notice the US only needed a slight, just even one drone striking a cargo ship was enough for the US to respond. So I do wonder if, for example, there was a provocation of a greater, another black swan event of a greater strength. If there was an accidental drone that for whatever reason flew close to the American Navy, the entire thing would ignite instantaneously. And yes, Lebanon is that second sort of wick that once ignited will, of course, blow the entire thing up into flames. We discussed it last week and the week prior. The MoU largely centers around peace in the eastern Mediterranean as much as the Straits of Hormuz. Of course, the second factor, the Lebanese Hezbollah question, the so to speak, understanding between Israel and Lebanon moving forward. This is something that Iran feels very sensitively about. So Hezbollah only stepped into the war against Israel this year in 2026 because they honored their agreement. They said, look, if Israel attacks Iran, we will respond and we will protect our Iranian cousins from across the Middle East, and we will actually strike Israel back. And that's what they did. So they kept up to their agreement. If Israel continues to encroach upon the Lebanese people and specifically attack Hezbollah, who are co-religionists with the Iranians, there's no doubt in my mind that Iran will, load up their ballistic missiles, take them out of their underground shelters, and begin firing at Israel once again. No doubt about that.
No, 100%. And remember, Hezbollah got involved, like you said, 2026 to fight alongside the Iranians. They got involved in 2024 after October 7th to fight for and defend the Palestinians who were facing genocide. So Hezbollah, the most moral army in the world, I guess, even though they don't have a nation all to themselves. They are the most powerful, I guess, non-state army in the world, and they've been able to hold their own, and it's very, very impressive. So that's a good place to transition. We have these U.S.-mediated Lebanon-Israel 14-point framework agreement. This is a sort of condensed version. The 14 points themselves are longer than this in detail, but I found this was a good summary after reading the longer points and then reading this. So we have point 1 here. It's end the conflict and formally transition toward a cessation of hostilities. 2, Israel will withdraw from Lebanon in phases contingent on evolving security conditions. 3, the Lebanese armed forces will progressively assume full responsibility for national security. 4, Hezbollah and all other non-state armed groups must be fully and verifiably disarmed. 5, Israel affirms it has no territorial ambitions in Lebanon and will withdraw once security threats are resolved. 6, Lebanon reaffirms the state's exclusive authority to maintain armed forces and declare war. 7, a U.S.-backed coordination and verification mechanism will oversee implementation. 8, both parties commit to a sovereign, stable Lebanon free from armed groups threatening either side. 9, the U.S. will support and strengthen the Lebanese armed forces with assistance tied to verified progress. 10, the U.S. will lead coordination of international reconstruction, humanitarian aid, and economic recovery efforts. 11, Lebanon and the U.S. will ensure that aid and reconstruction funds do not reach Hezbollah or other armed groups. 12, Israel and Lebanon will establish working groups to negotiate a comprehensive peace and security framework. 13, both sides will cease hostile political and legal actions and cooperate on the return of detainees and remains. 14, Israel and Lebanon acknowledge the U.S. role and express appreciation for President Donald Trump's leadership. And immediately when this came out, Hezbollah and their representatives rejected this. They warned Lebanese authorities that the Israel framework deal cannot be enforced without triggering a civil war. This is from Al-Mayadeen. Hezbollah member of parliament Hassan Fadlallah vowed that the group will confront any measure taken by Beirut to implement its commitments on the ground. Hezbollah said it will retain its weapons and opposes the Washington-signed framework at a serious level. Fadlallah said enforcement is impossible unless, with U.S. support, they go to civil war. So again, obviously, the deal signed between Israeli and Lebanese negotiators was from the Joseph Aoun led group delegation that has been in D.C. for the past few weeks working these details out with Israel, which again, it seems now that the plan And this was the statement from a prominent Israeli journalist, Ravi Drucker, who's host of a very popular program on Israel's Channel 13. So consider this like, I don't know, an Anderson Cooper type character of Israel. He says the Israeli plan in Lebanon is to divide the country and plunge it into a civil war to force the Lebanese government into a military confrontation with Hezbollah. Meanwhile, military correspondent Elan Ben David confirmed that this has been Israel's objective from the beginning. So I don't know if they're just spilling the spaghetti or just saying this to try to be confident, but it seems that obviously Hezbollah is going to refuse this. Trump and America will see this. Oh, well, they had the deal, so now we have to let Israel and the Lebanese forces that we're now going to arm go at it against Hezbollah. So America is going to start arming the Lebanese armed forces. Israel's going to advance from the south, and they're going to try to, I guess, pincer maneuver the Hezbollah and Shia militias that are fighting Israel. And unfortunately, it's probably not going to work. Well, fortunately, this is not going to work because a huge portion of people in the Lebanese armed forces are sympathetic to the resistance and Hezbollah, even if they're not Shia Muslim, and even if they wouldn't join Hezbollah, they certainly will not fight them on behalf of Israel and the United States. So if a civil war is on the horizon again, I mean, I guess it's every 20 years or so in Lebanon, right? It was the last one, 2006 into up through those few years. So you get a few years of peace, but it seems that, there's many reasons you could blame for it. But unfortunately, again, if you ally with the Jews or you have factions in your country that are willing to work with the Zionist entity against people within your nation, then this is how it's going to go. So I'd love your thoughts on those 14 points that we are looking at, Dmitry. Of course, not only is the civil war apparently in Israel's playbook, but this is from Middle Eastern Eye. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz have said that troops will maintain an indefinite presence in southern Lebanon, Syria, and the Gaza Strip. They were both speaking at a graduation for combat officers in southern Israel on Thursday. We dominate southern Lebanon from the summit of the Beaufort. They're talking about the Beaufort Fort, and we will remain as long as required in the security zone, Netanyahu said. We do not intend to withdraw from it. Katz said the Israeli military will remain in security zones in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Gaza without any time limit. He said that Israel opposed withdrawal from Lebanon despite all the pressures that exist and those that are yet to come. There's another important message which I hope is clearly understood in Tehran. If Iran attacks Israel because of our activities in Lebanon or for any other reason, we will strike it with full force in a way that will clearly demonstrate the gap in power between us, the defense minister added. Their comments come after Middle East Eye earlier this month revealed how Israel had built a line of military bases stretching through southern Lebanon and Syria, which appeared to suggest an intent to remain in territory seized since 2024. On Friday, the Israeli military continued operations across southern Lebanon, with Lebanon's national news agency reporting that troops bulldozed and burned down homes in the town of Markaba. The report said that airstrikes killed 2 people in Maifadun and wounded another, citing the country's health ministry. A separate strike was also reported in Nabatia al-Falka. The Israeli military said 4 soldiers, including 2 officers, were injured during what it described as a close-quarters clash with a Hezbollah fighter in Beit Yahun. It said the fighter threw a grenade before being killed in an exchange of fire. Israeli forces have killed at least 4,230 people in Lebanon since relaunching hostilities in early March, days after the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran began. Daily Israeli attacks on southern Lebanon have killed scores of people, despite a ceasefire having been agreed to weeks ago. And again, earlier today, Israel claimed it controlled the strategic heights in Ali al-Taher, around Nabatia in southern Lebanon, but not far southern Lebanon, more like barely southern eastern Lebanon. This is now the 8th claim they've made that they control this hillside, these heights, and Hezbollah denied Israel controls it immediately after the statement was released, saying that Hezbollah maintains the hill and it is under their control. So I believe that is near the Beaufort Castle area. That is sort of the spear, the farthest north that the Israelis are operating. It is still close to the Israeli occupied Golan Heights border, but that is what they're trying to take. I don't know why this is such an important specific territory for them. Perhaps it gives them a good strategic overlook. What they've mentioned about the castle, at least, is that it's obvious that they want to get as far as they can, get these super far-flung places, so that when negotiations come down, like, oh, we gave you Beaufort Castle, when they never should have even made it close to Beaufort Castle to begin with if they had ever abided by the ceasefire. So I'd love your thoughts on the 14-point plan, Hezbollah's rejection of it, Dmitry. What do you think this civil war may or may not look like? It seems that's what the Israelis want to happen, but I guess the decision will ultimately lie with the individual people in the Lebanese armed forces.
The Israeli strategy is very clear here because it's literally they're copy pasting. I mean, time-saving purposes, and even out of a monetary consideration, these people are golden calf worshippers, so they are obsessed with money, how to save costs. They don't need to really recreate the old plan. I think their plan is very similar, south of the Litani River, to that which took place in Gaza. With now Israel, at least as of May 2026, announced that it controls 60% of Gaza, that is the yellow line, is further and further constricting the Palestinians. In a similar way, they're going to be, no doubt, pincering, constricting the Lebanese people, and they're going to claim that it's a counter-terrorist operation specifically against Hezbollah, but in fact it's a territory grab. It's a constriction methodology, almost like a snake. And it's no coincidence that, of course, the elite Israeli soldiers are operating in the north of Israel against Hezbollah, the Tzanchanim paratroopers. So these are the airborne paratroopers of Israel. These are probably the Red Berets, probably the most elite Israeli infantry, paratrooper brigade that exists. And of course their symbol is the snake, the Palestinian viper snake with wings. And specifically, when you look at the background of this esoterically, like they actually quote Genesis 49:17, where it speaks about the tribe of Dan. Let Dan be a serpent by the way, an adder by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backwards, right? This prophecy of the Old Testament patriarch to his son Dan, of course, speaks about the tribe of Dan giving rise to the Antichrist. It's really weird that the Israeli elite units use this particular biblical verse from the Torah as their particular mantra, right? It's quite bizarre. And of course, all of the unit and division commanders of the Tzanchanim, they use all kinds of snakish names like boa constrictor, viper, cobra, asp, earth viper, things like this. It's quite uncanny. And of course, the winged serpent, it's like a demonic Quetzalcoatl sort of. It was very strange, but these people are not secular at all. Like, this is clearly really strange symbolism. And that's the particular strategy they're using. They're going to, just like in the West Bank, the Palestinians are being constricted, stripped from their lands, just like in the Golan Heights. The same methodology is going to be used upon the Lebanese people, but with the added, of course, sprinkling in of internal spasms and convulsions, which they're going to, of course, cause these eruptions within Lebanese society. They're going to make sure the Lebanese social cohesion is completely broken, so the community cannot unite around even like a moderately pro-Hezbollah faction within politics. Once they realize, wait a minute, it's actually civilian Lebanese people who are dying south of the Litani River, not necessarily all of them are Hezbollah operatives. Once that idea gets into the minds of all the Maronite Christians, the Catholics, those Orthodox Christians perhaps who are still somewhat on the fence or not sure if they support the Shia Muslim resistance in the south or not, and of course the Sunni Muslims who may be fence-sitting as well, then all of Lebanon will be united. And Joseph Aoun, people like this, these, of course, fence-sitters and lukewarm politicians in Lebanon will need to, of course, adhere to the people who have elected them into power, presuming that elections in Lebanon have been fair all this time. So I think the Israel's tactic at necessarily spreading dissent within Beirut and other major cities of Lebanon, whilst again pushing their assault forward, it's really genius. Really, it's the one thing that those traumatized and PTSD'd by the conflicts of the 1980s, by the Lebanese Civil War, are going to try to avoid at all costs, especially the old timers. They remember how bad it was when Christians went up against Shia Muslims and Shia Muslims went up against the Sunni Muslims within Beirut and other areas of Lebanon. They're going to try to avoid that, but at the same time, I think that particular fear of civil war will also maybe, and this is what the 14-point plan, I think, hopes for, Conrad, the fear of civil war within Lebanon may be what drives a lot of these lukewarm politicians, maybe because of the people they hang around who are just cowards and they are too scared to stand up to Israel. It'll force them to put pressure on Hezbollah to disband, to disarm, which Hezbollah we know will never do. Just the best example of this is the analogy to Gaza with the Palestinian resistance, the Hamas. Hamas still hasn't disarmed. And they've agreed to, the Board of Peace proposal and all these other things, but they still haven't disarmed because they understand as soon as they disarm, Israel will constrict them and choke them out entirely, just like the West Bank Palestinians, who more or less do not have that same level of independence because they don't have those, shall we say, Second Amendment privileges that the Palestinians in Gaza have, retained. And that's one of the reasons Gaza was in some ways more independent and more sovereign-minded than the West Bank of Palestine, which was, you can say, almost ideologically conquered long ago. And I think they want the same thing for the people of southern Lebanon, specifically for Hezbollah. They want to constrict them. They want to make sure that the Lebanese politicians at the top in Beirut completely abandon their brothers in the south and basically give them up to Israel. Even notice, Conrad, I wouldn't be surprised if there were amnesties given out as well to former Hezbollah fighters as part of the sort of lucrative package deal, the sort of sweetening, the making sure that, look, if you were a former, shall we say, quote unquote Hezbollah war criminal, you're allowed to, for example, leave and go to Iran or something, but you're not allowed to stay in Lebanon. Similar proposals were given to Hamas fighters as well. They're going to try and maybe sweeten the deal if these 14 points are, for example, not accepted by Naim Qassem. Who knows what exactly the idea will be, but it may eventually, this is one of the worst case scenarios, if Israel, of course, wants to keep pushing this ahead and Joseph Aoun and his government, of course, completely get behind the 14 points, is eventually we may see an exiled Hezbollah living somewhere in a country that is friendly, albeit probably not the Russian Federation, but most likely they'll be allowed to leave and go to Iraq or Iran or one of these other places that will, of course, home them. And I think this would be really unfortunate because at that point, Lebanon will be entirely subjugated to the will of the Israelis, the Americans, and basically the international coalition. Because notice, the United Nations, I think a spokesperson or a UN, one of the top aides already spoke out just over the last half an hour of us recording the show in favor of this 14-point plan. And again, you can notice it's the same 14 points as between the US and Iran, so they're pretty much copy-pasting a lot of these points. They're trying to appeal to Trump's mercy as well, so he would get involved maybe as a peacekeeper if things really break down. The sycophancy of the Lebanese status quo politicians, the ones who are in power now, especially those who are more or less neutral or friendly towards Israel, is completely sickening, because this is a nation which has been completely stripped of its sovereignty, its military, it's whatever's left of its military, Conrad, you've correctly said, it knows that Hezbollah is probably the last hope that Lebanon may have for any sort of retention of sovereignty going forward into the future. And the other danger is it's not just hyper-Zionist aggression just to the south of Lebanon, and even within Lebanon's borders now. It's literally the crazy Wahhabi Salafi jihadis whom the West and Israel supported, and of course Turkey for its own means supported them as well, just to Lebanon's east. Which again, how do you defend against rabid rapists, terrorists, and all these other criminals who have been imported in, tens of thousands of international fighters? So the Lebanese, like, hardcore people in their military who are still pro-Hezbollah, they understand, they can see what happened to the next door neighbor, Bashar al-Assad, who had a much stronger, much bigger military, and he still wasn't able to stand up to the importation of these crazy Sunni Muslim fighters and terrorists. So again, for Lebanon to retain this massive paramilitary organization such as Hezbollah, it's just the last sort of lifeline, really, practically speaking. It's the last shred of hope they have for the nation state to sort of retain any sort of semblance to what it was in the 20th century. I mean, this is the last lifeline they have, really.
No, it is. And again, Hezbollah, even, who knows how much they'd have to arm the Lebanese military to get it up to the same tier as Hezbollah. I mean, Hezbollah is at the cutting edge of drones and these other sorts of things. The Lebanese army, again, they're not even united behind a single cause, let alone united in their equipment and tactics and these other things. Again, I mean, there's going to be Shia people in the Lebanese army that aren't going to want to fight Hezbollah. There's going to be Christians in the Lebanese army that aren't going to want to fight Hezbollah. There's going to be every stripe of person that's going to be like, why aren't we fighting Israel with Hezbollah? So the idea that it would just be a clean cut Israel and Lebanon versus Hezbollah, that's not exactly how it goes. And again, people have been humorously pointing out, Joseph Aoun, Nawaf Salam, these people are more of a traitors to Lebanon than al-Jilani, al-Shura himself. Al-Jilani rejected fighting Hezbollah on behalf of America last week, whereas it seems like Joseph Aoun, Nawaf Salam are happy to work with Israel and agree to a plan that will inevitably plunge Lebanon into another bloody civil war. And of course, Israel does its classic, they claim they're not annexing, they claim they have no territorial ambitions until they have, you know what I mean? We're not annexing, we have no intentions, it's annexed already, we've already done it. That's how it goes. It's how they always do it. If they're faced with arms or they're faced with threats, they'll claim, this is all for our security, this is, we'll withdraw when we need to, and the next thing we were never withdrawing. What do you mean? We never said that. It's all, very Jewish. But we have to pray for Lebanon till still hundreds of thousands of people have not been able to return home. And again, Netanyahu, from the horse's mouth, they have no real plans of withdrawing. So again, if the Iranians mean what they say, and if Mojtaba Khamenei is truly the supreme leader, either Israel will be forced to rescind these statements and eat these words, or the war will be back on. And let's put it this way, either option wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me if We sort of get some attempts at U.S. pressure on Israel. They say some sort of mealy-mouthed things. We get some symbolic withdrawals. Iran is briefly satisfied. Hezbollah is briefly satisfied. Again, I don't even see that happening with this new deal. So again, I almost lean more towards the MoU and everything collapsing at this point, because if Lebanon descends into civil war, then Iran is going to have to make some serious readjustments and whatnot to how they're going to support Hezbollah and their other allies. And again, the same question might arise in Yemen. This is the latest reports from Yemen. It says violent clashes have yet again erupted along the Ad-Dali front in southern Yemen between Ansarallah and former Southern Transition Council forces. For those who don't know, the STC is the UAE-backed separatist group that want to have an independent state in southern Yemen. It says STC media report they thwarted a large-scale pro-al-Houthi forces attack. It says this is from Nasruddin Amir, Ansarallah's vice chairman of media, to Al Masira Media. He says, the decision has been made to end the status quo, the division of Yemen. Those Yemenis who want peace should negotiate directly with Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, where Ansarallah is headquartered. From now on, there is no future role for Saudi Arabia or any other external actor in further talks. If you, a Yemeni, want to come and talk, come and talk. The violation of Yemen's sovereignty by the Takfiri, which is an insulting term referring to Saudi-backed forces in Yemen, is coming to an end. And we are seeing videos and photos of huge, 100, 200 plus car convoys of large pro-al-Houthi members of the Bani Nof tribe from the Al-Jawf governorate in northern Yemen near the Saudi border. It says here, note, Bani Nof also exists under Saudi-controlled territory, and the group in those areas fiercely opposes Ansarallah. So who knows if there are shifts being made in that regard. But, Iran may be on the verge of supporting major operations to defend their allies in Lebanon and Yemen. And of course, you mentioned Palestine. There have been bombings in Gaza and the West Bank just in the past few days. So the axis of resistance is going to have to be active on all fronts. But I'd love your thoughts on the situation in Yemen, Dmitry, as well as any other thoughts on Lebanon, the civil war situation. Of course, Yaqub Saraf, 2 weeks ago when we had him on the show, he talks about how Nawaf Salam, who was meeting with al-Jawlani, potentially trying to convince him on behalf of the U.S. to move against Hezbollah. He is a Saudi-backed actor. Joseph Aoun is, of course, more aligned with the United States and whatnot. But again, the true people that represent Lebanon are, I think the axis of resistance, and then the Christians that are behind the resistance and want a true sovereign Lebanon and not an Israeli puppet, an American puppet, or a Turkish, Saudi, Sunni puppet either. And they say, oh, well, you just supported being an Iranian puppet. Well, Iran doesn't even share a land border with Lebanon, and they're the only ones that have supported and armed groups against Israeli invasion. So as far as I can tell, Iran is the only ally that Lebanon can depend on. And I fully agree with Naim Qassem that the better hope for a sovereign Lebanon and getting Israel out is America forcing it out on Iran's terms, not this silly ceasefire that is about to plunge the country into a civil war.
No, and let's not be too surprised that the Houthis are moving against the Southern Transitional Council forces in Yemen, and that the Houthis are actively, of course, engaged in some sort of warfare against this really false government, sort of West-supported transitional government. Unfortunately, in part, even supported somewhat by the Russian Federation. But let's not get too much into the details here. Yemen has been obviously a battlefield for decades at this point. But the Yemenis Houthis specifically, people underappreciate their veteranship in terms of, warfare in desert-like scenarios. They literally won a war in the 21st century against Saudi Arabia. Like, these people are exceptionally trained. They're very battle-hardened, very similar to the people of Syria. And I would also compare them perhaps to Hezbollah and also the fighters of the Palestinian resistance as well. So in that way, they do have that sort of kinship, although it's really clear, I think, that the Houthis have been given, I think, a green light by the IRGC. Most likely those IRGC forces, Conrad, that deal with their foreign allies, shall we say, abroad, and that, look, at this point, because the US is really fundamentally not necessarily adhering to the MoU, and Israel is continuing its aggression against both the Palestinians and against the Lebanese people, and also obviously expanding sort of unilaterally without any sort of consent or permission seeking into Syria. I think Iran basically said, look, if the Houthis, if you guys want to move against this sort of transitional Yemenese government, you're free to do so. We'll only continue supporting you. And I think the Houthis have taken this upon themselves to, of course, move in further. Because look, ultimately, Conrad, if the Houthis were to ever take over all of Yemen and have a Taliban-style government running that particular coastal region, this will be absolutely insane. It's almost another leverage point for Iran, almost like they create almost a second Strait of Hormuz type scenario. And of course, they even potentially could. So thinking from an Iranian perspective, to have the Houthis dominate Yemen is absolutely the way to go. It's almost like the Iranians, if they view Israel as a satellite state of the US. For Iran, it's very important to have the Yemenese Houthi government have as much power and as much influence over the Bab el-Mandeb Straits as they can. In that way, they would, of course, keep the entire world somewhat on edge if Israel or America begin to engage in some sort of wars of aggression against Iran and its allies. So fundamentally, yes, it may seem that Iran could be, for example, greenlighting this operation or provoking further escalations in Yemen. You have to keep in mind there was no real peace agreement between the Houthis and the transitional government to begin with. Yemen has been in a state of like a big question mark on the map for a very long time. There is no status quo. There is no delineation or some sort of peaceful line like between North and South Korea. Yemen has been, of course, almost a post-apocalyptic land of infighting as well as foreign invasions for a very long time. Even foreign invasion, people like Eric Prince supporting the United Arab Emirates to become involved quite recently as well, I believe in early 2026 or late 2025. There's absolutely, Yemen is just one of those places, Conrad, that it's only the strongest will rule, and I think it's not inappropriate for Iran necessarily, especially if we view it from the Iranian perspective, to keep supporting the Yemenis Houthis, even give them some of that drone technology, a lot of those, who knows, submarines, so to speak, drones that we see utilized, for example, in the Black Sea, and the Iranians have used in the past, some of the mining technology for sea mines, specifically related to the Gulf of Aden and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. Who knows what a powerful Houthi-controlled Yemen could be in terms of world affair controls and peace in the Middle East, so to speak. A proper balance of powers may require Yemen to exist as a pro-Iranian entity in order to keep the GCC states and Israel in check as well. So I think Iran is playing a very long game. Obviously, Yemen is just part of that puzzle, but also for the Yemenis Houthis themselves, they've been killed by American weapons for so long. I think they're just sick and tired of being oppressed by foreign invading forces, by their, unfortunately, almost co-religionist neighbors as well from the GCC states. And, they've sort of held their own for such a long time. And they were one of the only state groups, well, you can say this quite clearly, that have actually supported the innocent Palestinian people against genocide since October 7th. So I think we can clearly say the Yemenis Houthis, I think, are in the right here. And let's not be surprised if further escalations break out in Yemen. I think there's every reason in the Middle East for that to actually happen. And it won't necessarily be a bad thing for Iran either, especially if the Houthis, some of the photographs of their tribal forces gathering in the desert before they go on assaults is absolutely mesmerizing. It shows that there's some unity in that sort of pro-Iranian Houthi movement. And honestly, Ansarallah and the Houthis, Conrad, I think they're one of the most conscientious, one of the most moral forces in the Middle East. And that's as weird as that is to say, but they've actually been consistently on the correct side this entire time, which we can't say the same for many other nations, including Turkey.
100%. And the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, again, could come under closure by the Houthis at any moment. And you mentioned Turkey. It's good that we discuss that because some interesting comments were made from Trump this week, and the Israelis have been continuing to make moves against Turkey. The current sale of F-35s to Turkey is being reconsidered by Trump. This is from the Jerusalem Post. It says U.S. President Donald Trump raised eyebrows when he revealed on Wednesday that Turkey had come close to joining the conflict involving Iran, but ultimately stayed out of it after a personal request from him. At the same time, Trump showered Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan with praise, and later that day formally notified Congress of the White House's intention to sell dozens of jet engines worth more than $700 million to Turkey. The U.S. government is prepared to license the export of these items, having taken into account political, military, economic, human rights, and arms control considerations, the State Department said in its notification on Congress, which was dated June 24th and sent late on Wednesday. When speaking at the meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at the White House, Trump described his conversations with Erdogan during the regional crisis. I like him. He's a friend of mine, and he stayed out of the war. Trump said, he was a leading candidate to get involved in the war with Iran. Trump acknowledged Erdogan's strained relationship with Israel, but said the Turkish leader nevertheless respected his request. So what? So Erdogan was going to join the war on the side of Iran? I don't know about that, Donald. But he says he's not a big fan of Israel, as you know, Trump said, and I asked him to stay out of it, and he stayed out. Ahead of a planned visit to Turkey next month, Trump continued to lavish praise on Erdogan. Erdogan is a strong man, he said. Everything I've ever asked him to do, he's done. And of course, Israel is very much against the F-35 deal between the U.S. and Turkey. Trump has hinted that he might be interested in renewing the stealth jet program with the F-35s and giving that to Turkey, which is something Israel, goes against Israel's strategic superiority doctrine, where they say that the U.S., if they do give technology that Israel has, they have to basically give Israel the better version of the technology, so they always maintain a strategic edge in the region. And further, to move against Turkey, Israel, this is from Ynet, it says Israel to weigh first official recognition of Armenian genocide amid tensions with Turkey. Foreign Minister Gideon Saar will ask the government to approve a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide on the basis of a moral and historical duty, a move likely to anger Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan as Washington considers selling F-35 jets to Ankara. A day after U.S. President Donald Trump praised Turkish President Erdogan as Washington weighs a possible sale of F-35 fighter jets to Turkey, Israel is moving toward a step Erdogan is unlikely to welcome. Foreign Minister Gideon Saar announced Thursday evening that he will bring to the next government meeting a resolution calling for Israel's first official recognition of the Armenian genocide. The draft resolution says that on the basis of the moral and historical duty, Israel will recognize the genocide committed against the Armenian people in the final period of the Ottoman Empire. It also says Israel should condemn the denial, minimization, or distortion of the historical truth surrounding those events. The explanatory notes to the proposal say the Armenian genocide began in April 1915 with the arrest, deportation, and killing of hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, leaders, and educated figures in Constantinople. Yeah, see, it makes no mention of the Christian nature of the genocide. The Greeks, who were part of the major other element that were genocided at that time, are not mentioned at all. And how is this going to fare with Israel's actual genocide of Armenians in Jerusalem that they are committing as they drive Armenians out of the Armenian quarter and Christians out of the Christian quarter? I mean, you have to wonder, Israel, they're quite up to date on this whole genocide recognition thing when it comes to, the Holocaust and whatnot. Why hadn't they already recognized the Armenian genocide? Well, they've always been against recognizing things like the Armenian genocide, the Holodomor, because they don't think Christians can be the victim of genocide. And when it comes to the Holodomor and the Armenian genocide, in many cases, Jews were actually behind the genocides themselves or aided the main perpetrators. In the case of the Armenian genocide and the Turks, the Jews were ready supporters of the Ottomans and all of those people who genocided the Christians, Armenian, Greek, or otherwise. So very interesting that now I guess Israel views Turkey as such an enemy that, all right, we got to recognize the Armenian genocide and get another, start to, build rapport against Turkey once again. And of course, Israel's trying to assert themselves as more important of an ally to the U.S. than Turkey is as a NATO member. But Trump is clearly much more pleased with Erdogan now than he is with Netanyahu. So interesting to see where that goes. But I think, again, we've predicted it, but it's continuing to happen, and it will continue to happen over the rest of this year. Israel will continue to move against Turkey. That will be their next major front, as they're openly saying. They had a recent statement. I forget who it is. Whoever it was, the Israeli ethnic politics spokesperson or whatever his name was, Amsregel Chai or whatever his weird Jew name was, he talked about how, openly said that might have been at the Jerusalem News Syndicate as well or something adjacent to it. He said that Iran is no longer the main enemy of Israel. Turkey, Qatar, Pakistan, Egypt, and Syria, this new Sunni belt, this new terrorist bloc that has emerged is the new real enemy of Israel. And people said within the next 15 years, Israel will be at war with Egypt and Turkey, and they think Pakistan's nukes are a threat to them in the midst of all this because Pakistan is allied with these countries, and Qatar and Al Jazeera, and again, Turkey and Qatar's control of Syria, which is why all these statements from Israel Katz and Netanyahu saying that Israel will never leave Syria because they think they have to confront Turkey there. So that is the current status of everything in the Turcosphere when it comes to Israel. Again, Israel, I think, is going to be the aggressor against Turkey that will either facilitate the fall of Erdogan or what will eventually facilitate the fall of Erdogan, whether Erdogan fights back against Israel. That's what we're going to, I guess, see soon. But I think Israel will ultimately succeed in dethroning Erdogan and It may take Trump getting out of office. Trump may like Erdogan enough to support him as long as he has power. So maybe Erdogan stays alive through Trump's term, or maybe Metropolitan Neophytos is correct. And, Trump is pumping Erdogan up, preparing him to make more and more of these operations, then Israel will take him out. So what are your thoughts on all of that, Dmitry?
Absolutely, intense rhetoric coming out here from Donald J. Trump, almost admitting that, maybe he did have some information about Turkey wanting to join Iran against the war in Israel. Like, it's completely insane. Like, he's saying it in almost a joking fashion, but the implications of that would mean, of course, a inter-NATO conflict, because the US would instantaneously stand up, of course, for their greatest ally, the Zionist state of Israel, which isn't even a member state of NATO. And, you'd have a US Turkish war or something of that sort. So it would be absolutely apocalyptic for the Middle East, and definitely much worse than what we've seen thus far. And Mark Levin's comment, of course, and I'll quote him: "Stop giving our best technology away to Islamist nutjob Erdogan. Turkey became a NATO member long before Erdogan seized power," unquote. So Mark Levin, obviously the Talmudic lobby, is well and truly against the F-35 transfer, as you said, Conrad, correctly. But look, $800 million is not that much money when it comes to F-35 stealth fighters, Lockheed Martin style, irrespective of which subgroup of F-35s are provided, because each F-35 is between 80 and 110 million American dollars. So that's what, 7-8 planes at most, right? Which, again, if you compare that to the aerial fleet of Israel and Greece combined, it simply still won't match. But it does show that at least, perhaps, and look, I'm not going to say that Turkey can begin developing their own jet technologies, but one of the primary reasons why the F-35s were not sold to Turkey back during, shall we say, the heated moments of the Syrian civil war was because Russia actually struck I believe it was a S-300, S-400 deal with Turkey in 2016 and 17, and America had to cut off its F-35 deal to Turkey at the same time, because they said, look, we can't have one nation having both Russian anti-stealth, anti-air missile SAM systems and have our best F-35 airplane. Therefore, well, it would literally may mean, like, of course, some sort of cross-contamination of technology. There could be, of course, Russian spies involved. There could be some, stealing of or figuring out how exactly the Russian air defense systems can be developed or improved further to defeat the Lockheed Martin planes. So the F-35 deal was cut back in 2017, and almost 10 years later now, Trump is proposing to, sell Turkey just a small batch of F-35 planes. Look, it's not going to be enough to empower the Turkish Air Force, to overcome both Israel and Greece at the same time in the future, Conrad, but I think it's a worthwhile step. Truly, Turkey has been a great ally of America. Look, they've literally ousted Bashar al-Assad's regime. Like, with the assistance of HTS and the other Sunni Muslims, they've served America really loyally. They've actually kept out of Israel, and they've allowed America's so-called greatest ally, Israel, to commit the genocide against Palestine with no questions whatsoever. Turkey has more or less not sided with Russia in the entire Black Sea crisis, but also not hindered Ukraine, of course, another apparent ally of America in Eastern Europe. They've almost remained somewhat neutral and always keeping some tension there between Ukraine and Russia, and not necessarily agitating Russia. In some ways, maybe you can say delaying the whole process, right? By inviting Russia continuously to these Istanbul, Ankara talks, which end up, of course, the only outcomes from them are, of course, an exchange of the ceased bodies of troops of Russians and Ukrainians, and that's pretty much it. There's no necessarily even ceasefire talks that have reached any ultimate results thus far. So in some ways, Turkey has served America's purposes and the purposes of NATO quite loyally, and why shouldn't Trump reward them? And also look at it from this other perspective, Conrad. What if an empowered Turkey with a much stronger navy in the next coming years? Before 2030, Turkey will have an incredibly powerful fleet. It will have a new aircraft carrier larger than the Charles de Gaulle. It will have an entirely new fleet of destroyers, and why not give them a powerful air force? The stronger the Turkish military, the more Orthodox Christian Greeks will die when the Turks finally do fight them. So in some ways, I always also doubt those F-35s given to the Turks will necessarily be used expressly against the Israelis. Like, who knows? I mean, there are obviously the risk for the Turks from their perspective, Conrad, buying this American technology is the same risks Saddam Hussein took when he purchased the SAM surface-to-air missiles, the anti-air defense systems from the USSR, is that, look, there may be backdoors built into that tech, even during the Cold War, like a lot of those switches that prevent for example, certain bombs to be used against friendly targets, and will those F-35s, for example, fly past the Lebanese borders into Israel? Like, or will they suddenly switch off, or their stealth technology will be sabotaged internally? Will there be glitches in the matrix in the system? Who knows exactly, right? But I wouldn't necessarily trust any technology coming from Lockheed Martin or the American military industrial complex at this point, because it's so thoroughly Judaized. Do you really think F-35s from Lockheed Martin will be used against Israel? I doubt that. I think these F-35s will be used to bomb Athens, to destroy Orthodox Christian churches, and who knows what other atrocities in the coming war that will lead to, well, the other things that the Orthodox elders and clairvoyant saints of our church have spoken about in the future. So unfortunately, I think, Conrad, any weaponry that Trump gifts or sells to Turkey, although it appears to somewhat be a balancing of powers in the Middle East, I think inevitably the long-term consideration, maybe it's not even Trump's, but the people who whispered these ideas into Trump's ears, the ones who gave him the briefs and the proposals, I think ultimately the goal will be to, of course, kill as many Christians with this tech as possible. Even after Erdogan, who do you think will get the F-35 plans? It will be the new sort of Kemalist Turk regime, the Freemasons, the Bolshevik-supported sort of Talmudic tribe of Turkey that will run things, and of course the hyper-nationalist forces that will, I think, engage in further genocide against Orthodox Christians. The genocide which now, as you said correctly, is being swept under the rug because of the other malicious actors involved in the particular killing of Orthodox Christians of the 20th century. So yeah, the genocide of the 21st century may be well and truly supported by Lockheed Martin planes. Who knows?
No, it's true. And again, whether Israel is responsible for Erdogan being ousted, whether he has a more natural death or whatnot, or there's more, again, internal disruptions, again, whether it's earthquakes, I mean, we're seeing earthquakes all around the world. We'll talk more about that in a second, or economic distress, or again, something going on with the Black Sea and energy, all these sorts of things. Maybe that facilitates it. We don't know exactly, but Erdogan will be coming under pressure here, I think, very, very soon. And I think Israel is the most likely culprit. And again, like you said, Greece will face its small slap when, as the prophecies say, is Turkey takes 3 of those islands. They'll close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. Then Russia will begin to advance. And again, let's say that it wouldn't surprise me, maybe Russia really does take the gloves off in response to some of these recent Ukrainian strikes and the apparent lack of an understanding in Anchorage that there ever was. Maybe massive advances in Ukraine will, everyone will be like, oh, finally it's happening. Maybe it does happen and Russia wins the war in Ukraine, but it's completely overshadowed by rapid deterioration of events in Turkey. And next thing you know, World War III is more obvious to everybody than it was before. And no one even gets to recognize what happened in Ukraine because everyone's so distracted by what's going on in Turkey, the Middle East, Greece, Israel, all these places where Russia is advancing south, and Iran would still be involved. Next thing you know, China gets involved, right? Things can always escalate very quickly. But before we move to the Russia-Ukraine front, we did have this story, a headline here from Anti-War. It's like, Italy tells Iran it didn't support U.S. war, rejecting claims from NATO chief. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani spoke with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi on Thursday and assured him that Italy didn't support the U.S. war against Iran after NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte claimed that 500 U.S. military aircraft took off from bases in Italy during the U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign. Italy has never taken part in any military initiative and has never authorized the use of bases for war actions against Iran in the strictest respect of the treaties with the United States, Tahani said in a statement on his call with Araghchi. Rutte's comments claimed after Italian officials had repeatedly said that Italy didn't authorize direct military action to be taken against Iran from Italian soil, though the Italian Defense Ministry did acknowledge that technical and logistical non-kinetic activities were authorized during the bombing campaign. So Italy, they continue to move away from the U.S. Trump is having a feud with Meloni. They're continuing to go back and forth. But again, Meloni, she didn't want to support, the war against Iran for the Jews, I guess, but she still wants to let in a bajillion Indian immigrants and whatnot. So interesting choices there. But as far as the situation in Russia and Ukraine, on the ground, we have this update. Ukrainian authorities have issued mandatory evacuation orders from 12 border settlements in Chernigov Oblast, including 2 that border Belarus. Approximately 1,000 civilians remain in these 12 villages, including 120 children. Evacuations will begin on July 1st and are expected to be completed within 2 months. Seems the Ukrainians might be expecting a broader offensive coming from the north, from the Russian border near Belarus there. We have updates on Konstantinovka It says over the last week, the situation has continued to deteriorate for Ukrainian forces in Konstantinovka as Russian forces continue to clear the remaining parts of the city, still under Ukrainian control. Additionally, Russian forces have intensified assault operations on the flanks of the city in preparation to advance toward Druzhkovka once Konstantinovka is captured. As recently seen in Pokrovsk and Mirograd, some of the areas of Konstantinovka shown in red contain small isolated groups of Ukrainian soldiers trapped in individual positions behind the lines. These positions do not pose any significant threat to Russia and do not affect their offensive, hence why they are not represented by any gray zone on the map. So if you look at the map that currently exists, Konstantinovka is almost entirely encircled right now and has effectively fallen entirely to the Russians at this point. But one of the big updates in Russia that doesn't have to do with the actual front is the gasoline situation. And this is from Bloomberg. It says here, Russia's gasoline crunch spreads after refinery attacks. Russia's gasoline crunch is worsening, with at least 2/3 of the country's regions introducing fuel rationing or suffering supply disruptions following relentless Ukrainian drone attacks on refineries. On an almost daily basis, regional governors from areas bordering Ukraine to the Amur region near China are being forced to limit sales at filling stations and to try to deter panic buying. The scale of disruptions vary across Russia but are intensifying and risk getting even worse if drone strikes increase. Kiev targeted the oil processing sector in recent months to curb fuel supplies and bring the war home to Russia. That has halted the operations of several key refineries. Of course, I've read elsewhere, apparently Crimea is suffering the most and having the most shortages. I guess that somewhat makes sense. Of course, in the midst of all of this, Marco Rubio also came out and said that there was never any agreement between Donald Trump and Putin at the Anchorage, Alaska meeting. When even was that? Was that last year, earlier this year? Who remembers? It was so obviously irrelevant to me, but the Russians seem to make a big deal out of these things. But ultimately, as far as if someone had to express my opinion on it, I sort of agree with our good friend Jim Jatras, who said, lots of heavy breathing, that Rubio has revealed that, wait for it, there was no agreement between Trump and Putin in Alaska. And he's like, what, really? You mean that after not 1 inch eastward, after the 1244 resolution on Kosovo, after Minsk, after Istanbul, you mean the Russians fell for the West's lies again? Oh, but I'm sure they finally wised up this time. So I guess with all of that, with all of the latest updates on the front lines and the situation at home with the fuel, Dmitry, what is the situation? Are the Russians finally going to take the gloves off and start advancing? Will we see an offensive from Belarus or more offensives from through Sumy and these other places? What's going on? It seems that more and more people are starting to get frustrated with the slow pace of the war. And remember last week, Lukashenko openly said the reason the war is going as slow as it is because of the Jews.
No, we have to agree with Batska Lukashenko 100%, and he's correct. It's not just the Roman Catholics, it's also the members of the Talmudic tribe are slowing it down, as within Russia, and so without. Obviously, the forces within Ukraine are sending people into the meat grinder, sending innocent Ukrainians as well as brainwashed Ukrainians, or further brainwashing Ukrainian youths as they turn 18, go into their early 20s, and then they get sent in to the front lines, and as well members of Talmudic tribe outside of Ukraine and Russia, both financing and fundraising this entire slaughter and ritual sacrifice. So he entirely correct. And look, over the last week, and these numbers may shock some of you, but just keep in mind, Russia produces between 10 and 15,000 drones per day, okay? And Ukraine produces around, the estimations are between 20 and 25,000 drones a day. I know this is absolutely insane. It's not just about creating the drone. You also need to launch it, pilot it, arm it with explosives and whatnot. But the drone production numbers are insane, absolutely staggering. And yet, still the attacks are just as bad. So over the past week, Russia was attacked by 4,562 drones. The Russians shot down 5 Storm Shadow missiles, 6 HIMARS rockets, 89 other aerial bombs shot by Ukrainian airplanes, right, dropped off by probably those F-16s that were provided to Ukraine almost, more than 12 months ago now, that the Ukrainians have been training in Romania how to fly them, and in other airports in Western Ukraine, which somehow is still functional. Again, question marks as to how these F-16s can even fly into the air at this point, 4 years into the war, right? And Zelensky has officially announced, amidst all this heavy bombing, this is on the 25th, 26th of June, Zelensky has announced an SBU 40-day operation against Russia. So Zelensky openly said that we have a goal of achieving an end to the war over the next 40 days. And this was said, well, at this point, you're listening at the 36th day of this particular operation. But what does the SBU typically do from, the Ukrainian SBU is the CIA equivalent, and they commit terror acts within the Russian Federation itself. Not only of course, killing Russian generals, but also killing innocent civilians, journalists, and other people of notoriety within Russia to demoralize the population. And of course, they also imprison Orthodox Christian clergymen within Ukraine itself. So 40 days of what? Terrorist attacks? What has exactly Zelensky announced? We haven't really seen any fruits of this announcement yet, but I think keep tracking our Telegram and our X and Twitter accounts, because we will be following exactly what developments have come from this particular statement of Zelensky recently. So there are more accusations Zelensky's throwing against Belarus, saying that there's an increase in the Ukraine's border guard service. They're noticing the Ukrainian border guard service on the border of Ukraine and Belarus are noticing Belarusian military activity on the other side. Lukashenko has denied everything. Or no, more correctly, the foreign minister Sibiga said basically that he does not expect Minsk to enter the war. And I think correctly, as we said last week, Conrad, there's no sort of notice that Lukashenko will be joining the war. Lukashenko has been, if anything, like the key peacemaker of the entire conflict. He's the one who actually stopped the Prigozhin's march on Moscow by giving that phone call. And none of us even knew, including journalists within Russia, had no idea Lukashenko even knew Prigozhin personally, but apparently he could have, he definitely prevented the loss of hundreds of lives within Russia itself, maybe thousands. And necessarily, if you notice, Lukashenko, throughout all of his speeches over the last few years, he's constantly pressed the idea that there needs to be more or less a peaceful diplomatic solution to the war in the Donbass, and of course the lines of delineation, and of course buffer zones need to be formed, etc. But he's always taken a very peaceful position, unlike some of the Siloviki within Russia who have a much more, shall we say, hawkish point of view against the so-called Banderites, neo-Nazis within Ukraine. They have a much more scorched earth approach to all of it. So Lukashenko noticed he doesn't really emphasize the whole neo-Nazi Banderite thing as strongly as the Russians do, at least the Russian politicians who speak openly about it, including people like Medvedev. But, notice, Conrad, not just Konstantinovka is being completely engulfed by the Russians, but also cities like Kupiansk and some of the other cities next up in line. And this is analysis from a top Russian geopolitical analyst, Valery Shiryaev. And Shiryaev has pointed out multiple times that the main reason why the Russians haven't actually approached Zelensky directly with a ceasefire talk is because their main priority is, of course, to take the rest of the Donetsk People's Republic. So they want to take those 5 cities of Liman, Konstantinovka, Drushkovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. And at this rate of slow movement, like you said, Konrad, Shiryaev had the same opinion. He said, at this rate, the next cities to fall will be Liman, Konstantinovka this year for sure, maybe over the next month. Then most likely Drushkovka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk there's no way Slavyansk will fall this year in 2026. Most likely it'll be pushed over into the most likely late winter period, or maybe even autumn, summer of 2027. So the pace is so excruciatingly slow that it has forced some frustrations, obviously from Russian political commentators and those on the inside in the military. And specifically this week, there was an absolutely abnormal sort of story. We haven't seen something like this since a couple of years ago, when a veteran of the Russian front lines has spoken out that he's against immigrants not being enlisted into the Russian military. And then that particular Russian veteran promptly disappeared when his battle commander sent him into a frontal assault at some point on the Russian front lines. I won't mention his name, but his clips have been posted online. And look, he's been gone for a year and a half now. So if you're in the Russian military and look, the same goes for the Ukrainian military, you speak out some sort of displeasure about how the conduct of the war is going, you may not expect to live very long. I think sort of critics of the Russian military are, the rules are quite strict. But this particular gentleman, he went all out. His name is Alexander Lunin. And Lunin and he's a veteran, well accredited. You can see in the video and this video is now being, of course, propagated and pushed forward by mostly Western liberal Ukrainians are posting it, but also Russian patriotic news sources are also promoting it, because this is a real veteran. He has awards for bravery, courage, or his chest is full of medals. He's a 39-year-old man, and Alexander Lunin has openly said that, look, if he said that there's clear violations of the rights of soldiers happening on the Russian side. Russians, for example, are imprisoning soldiers who are refusing to adhere to suicidal orders of being thrown into the meat grinder. And he says there's hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers that he knows who are right now sitting in Russian, basically military police, like prison camps, because they refused to follow these orders of actually being sent to the slaughter into drone or minefields and things like that. And in the video, the things he says, of course, are probably the most striking, and this is quite shocking, where he openly says, look, I need to speak to Vladimir Putin personally on live television in the Kremlin. He says, I want an audience of President Putin. I want to see and speak to him. If President Putin does not meet me in the Kremlin and not take me in and hear what I have to say about the state of the front lines and what's happening on the war front in the special military operations zone, then who knows, maybe the people behind me and the soldiers will turn their arms against the Kremlin itself. And he openly says this, his words, which again reminds us, of course, of June 2023 when Prigozhin and Wagner, of course, began their march for justice through Rostov-on-Don and all those other areas that are now being, again, bombed so intensely by Ukrainians as they're striking these oil refineries all over European Russia. So all those zones Prigozhin traversed through are now basically parts, almost like they've been upgraded to special military operations zones themselves. It's quite unfortunate. But Lunyan's comments, it's already been reposted by Tsargrad. It has, at this point, over 11 million views on Telegram, so quite a bit. Almost 10% of all Russians have watched this particular video. It's very, very striking. And in fact, famous Russian, I would say center-left journalist within Moscow, he's quite a pro-United Russia gentleman, Vitaly Borodin. Not the nicest guy, definitely. He may be Jewish as well. He's officially invited Alexander Lunin to come to Moscow, and he says that I will try my best to give you an audience with President Putin. And Dmitry Peskov, this secretary, the press secretary of Vladimir Putin, has said that he's seen the video, and he says that the video has been passed on to people inside United Russia and inside of the presidential cabinet. But he says there's something strange, he says, about the wording used by Alexander Lunin. Yeah, of course. He literally says, if you don't listen to me, we'll have a revolution in Russia. Yes, of course the wording seems strange. It's quite extreme. There are, of course, people who claim this is a Ukrainian diversion. Alexander Lunin, there's some people claiming he has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He's been traumatized by the bombs and explosions, which no doubt probably more than half of the soldiers on the front lines are traumatized in one way or another. I mean, modern warfare is much more horrendous than any war in human history. And so I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say this particular soldier is mentally ill when we've literally seen other soldiers and commanders say very similar things, except with much, much less stringent demands. He wants to meet Putin personally, and he's literally a nobody. Doesn't he understand Putin only meets with members of his own party and international delegates? And maybe if you're a Talmudic oligarch like Abramovich, Putin will meet with you as well. But if you're a soldier, well, that's not entirely correct, because Putin didn't meet Gabriel Doroshin at the RT celebration. So let's not get too ahead of ourselves. So who knows how this story will develop itself, but it all comes amidst, obviously, Conrad, as you said earlier, the intense terroristic bombing of Moscow. The Moscow Oblast has shot down, or the air defense systems in Moskovskoye Oblast has shot down 49 drones just today. So literally, allegedly, Ukrainians are claiming Russia is bringing all of its air defense systems into the Moscow Oblast to defend the capital city. I don't think that's true. I think in fact, there's so many air defense systems in European Russia that I think they're handling it quite fine. In fact, a recent law has been passed within the Russian Federation that allows private businesses to actually purchase air defense systems. So mega corporations, mega factories, especially if there's a private warehouse, some sort of industry, a major factory, which can suffer, millions of dollars of loss if a Ukrainian drone or a swarm of drones smashes into their particular infrastructure and can put them out of business. It's actually cheaper for them to hire a small Buk or a Pantsir, and they also need to hire the military, because obviously they don't own a Pantsir surface-to-air defense missile system, right? That's crazy. That's like Second Amendment on steroids. No, they don't own an entire aerial cannon, but technically that particular air defense system will be on their private property and it will serve their own needs. So there's literally what we're seeing in Russia is private air defense hiring. You can literally hire an entire crew for air defense system and radars and have your private mega business defended, which is, the Ukrainians have been doing this for all over 3 years. They have a very, shall we say, libertarian approach to anti-air defense, and the Russians are copying their particular tactics, which I think may be correct. Less stress on the government, less red tape, have big corporations which can suffer massive losses, they're able to pay hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to these troops to station them, feed them, clothe them, and also for their massive arsenals to be located on their private property for defense reasons. Because look, the Ukrainians aiming for civilian targets, so why not exactly defend your own citizens by these interesting means? But yeah, the Russo-Ukrainian war, Conrad, it's definitely heating up. I think it'll be interesting to see what exactly Zelensky had in mind when he said there's a 40-day sort of sprint to end the war. And, given the recent bombardment, the killing of the children in Lugansk and all these other bombing raids against school buses, things like this, I mean, will we see a Russian response? I think that's the biggest question mark, and who knows exactly how the Russians will respond. Because even if Kupiansk and Konstantinivka fell tomorrow, right, I don't think it would necessarily strike very strongly against Ukrainian morale. They've lost cities, major cities in sieges before, and they just seem to bounce back because the amount of foreign aid they receive, of course, it almost recoups all of the losses, morally speaking, when they have hundreds of millions of dollars coming in from NATO, from the EU. It seems to, of course, sober them up, and they don't remain in depression very long. So, yeah, maybe there needs to be a strike against the executive decision makers in Kiev by the Russian military. Who knows exactly? But these suggestions have been given in the past.
Yeah, I think anything short of major strikes on high-ranking military and political figures in Ukraine is not going to be enough for the patriotic people on the front line and elsewhere in Russia. Last few stories about Russia-Ukraine here. It says here, Colonel Dmytro Kozyra, former head of the security service of Ukraine's counterterrorism department, has been convicted of treason and sentenced to life in prison. Kozyra was reportedly recruited by Russia's Federal Security Service in Vienna in 2018 and remained in contact with the FSB until his arrest in 2025. Ukraine's prosecutor general said Kozyra had systematically transmitted information about the consequences of missile strikes on objects in Kiev, the locations of SBU units, data from military units, official documents, and analytical materials, along with information about critical infrastructure and Ukraine's gas infrastructure and systems. So, I mean, anyone can be suspect on either side of this thing from an intelligence perspective. And another big story, this is from Dave DeCamp on anti-war. It says France on Thursday announced that its forces seized another tanker linked to Russia, which came as Ukrainian drones targeted Russian oil infrastructure. As Russia's oil industry continues to face pressure from both Ukraine and its Western backers, French President Emmanuel Macron said in a post on X that French forces boarded the tanker Deliver while it was in the Mediterranean Sea off Sicily. Ship tracking data show that the vessel flying the Cameroonian flag was recently in the Russian Baltic Sea port of Primorsk. Macron said the ship was part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet, a term Western leaders used to describe vessels that ship Russian oil despite U.S. and European sanctions. Russia rejects the characterization, saying the oil sanctions are a unilateral policy not approved by the UN Security Council and not part of international law. In response to the seizure, Russia's embassy in Paris denounced the move as piracy and said it was illegal under international law for French forces to seize the ship. According to Reuters, 9 Russia-linked tankers have now been seized in Europe this year, including 4 by France, 1 by the UK and the English Channel, and 3 that were stopped and inspected as part of a European naval mission in the Mediterranean. The increase in the seizures came with an escalation of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia targeting oil facilities, including attacks on Thursday that sparked a fire at the Poltavskaya oil depot in Russia's southern Krasnodar region. Ukraine's drone attacks deep inside Russia, which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calls long-range sanctions, are known to be supported by U.S. and NATO intelligence, meaning the operations always risk a potential escalation between Russia and the Western military alliance. And the only other story, and I'd like to get your reaction to those stories as well as this one, Dmitry, is many people might have seen the infamous picture going around from Africa of the removed African limbs, or organized in the shape of a swastika, which were apparently was done so by the African Corps, formerly Russian fighters. Headline here, it says, Russian Africa Corps and Malian troops accused of killing civilians and arranging remains into swastika. Russia's Africa Corps and Mali's army killed 4 civilians in northern Mali this week, then arranged one victim's dismembered body into a swastika. I did see this picture. According to French broadcaster RFI, local residents and a Malian rights group reported that the dead were known herders with no ties to armed groups. The killings took place on June 23rd near the villages of Zaro and Abokura, 3 kilometers apart where the Timbuktu and Gao regions meet. RFI reported a joint patrol of Malian troops and African Corps fighters had passed through the area. Residents near Zaro then found 2 bodies in a staged scene. The dismembered remains of one victim were found arranged in the shape of a swastika on the sand, with the severed head positioned to the center of the limbs, which, interesting. But in the midst of all of this, we obviously have seen general advances of the Tuareg and Jnim terrorist rebels in Mali. Burkina Faso recently severed all diplomatic relations with France, claiming that France is supporting these groups against the juntas like in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger, and who are supported by the Russian Africa Corps. Again, who knows if they actually did this thing with the swastika? It's kind of, in a very morbid way, it's sort of humorous with everything going on there, I guess. But I wanted to get your reaction to the swastika limb story, Dmitry, and as in general, just the Russian Africa situation, as it seems whoever is currently leading the Africa Corps may not be quite as capable as Prigozhin and Utkin. But I'd also like your take on the tanker and Dmitry Kuzyota's stories as well.
No, look, it shouldn't be surprising. Donald Trump, I think, just openly, if you recall, relating to the Straits of Hormuz, he did sort of outright say that, we are pirates, like, in a joking fashion. He thinks like the Pirates of the Caribbean sort of scenario is going to entertain people, but we're well and truly far away from Hollywood at this point. But Donald J. Trump is the entertainer. And look, the Europeans capturing Russian vessels, I think that's the biggest concern for Russia is if Russia is going to continue supplying Cuba and use its Baltic commercial fleet to do so, it needs to make sure that Baltic Sea, Atlantic Ocean gateway remains completely open, and French, British ships don't harass them any longer. I mean, and I don't know if Russia's Baltic Sea fleet is large enough to actually accommodate and convoy all of these various ships from the ports of Primorsk and St. Petersburg, etc., very safely without being harassed by these NATO vessels. Very, very concerning, obviously, because that's a point of provocation, which I don't know if Russia's going to address if more of their ships are harassed or even taken over in the future. It'll be horrifying. Regarding the limbs in a shape of a swastika in North Africa in the Sahel, look, it's not surprising. A lot of those African Corps members are, they're quite hardcore, no pun intended, in terms of their views about, shall we say, Slavic symbolism, a lot of that folklore. A lot of them are neo-pagan by association, or even by just simply their appreciation for those particular symbols, or even pre-Christian symbols. We know the founder of Wagner, Dmitry Utkin himself, had a SS tattoo, and he had the black sun tattoo on his elbow, and he called himself Wagner after the famous German composer. So it was very sort of clear to him where his particular interests lie, and his reasoning behind it, and the naming, and his particular fascination of that sort of Germanic, shall we say, Germanic culture, was that, look, it's part of our sort of Slavic Germanic joint heritage anyway, and he just likes it. He said it was purely for aesthetic purposes. And look, the savagery of the Sahel African fighting against both the Tuaregs and the Janim is so intense, because the fighters of Tuareg and Janim, they kill not only Russians in savage ways, they also kill the local Sahelian, Mali, Nigerians. They kill the people of Niger, anyone they really come across that doesn't necessarily join their group, and citizens of Burkina Faso in major savage ways. There's a lot of Russian interviews from that particular region, members of Wagner, the Africa Corps, veterans who have been to North Africa to fight against these terroristic forces, and all of them say how these duhi, they call them spirits. So these spirit fighters, these African terrorists, the way they behave, so they plant basically mines all over the place. You have locals who are wandering towards wells with donkeys blowing up. And so it's not surprising if you're walking around the African wilderness to hear an explosion in the distance, and then to hear the cries of innocent civilians who just get blown up on these homemade sort of gasoline tank landmine bombs that the Janim and the Duhi Tuaregs create. And yes, the Tuaregs at this point have more or less allied themselves with basically Janim, which is the North African, the Black ISIS, as we call it here on the show. So it's really concerning. And, in order to scare these people off, the savagery of war, this terrorism against the civilian population of North Africans of all these nations, simply because they don't want to be Islamic extremists, it was sort of, this is just something that happens. It's just the human emotion, I think, brought to the brink, and sort of the positioning of limbs of terrorists. It's just simply, it's morbid. It's a bit of a joke, but let's not necessarily moralize it too hard, because the fighting in North Africa is so extremely savage that even a photograph like this is simply, it's equivalent to those reports about, American and Australian troops taking, for example, prosthetic limbs from Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. At some point in warfare, there are these sort of questionable things committed, and there's simply no way to comment on it. And that's because war is the state. It's similar to disease and plague. It's a state of the fallen world. There's nothing natural or good about it. It's simply something we need to, unfortunately, that we're sort of almost forced to engage in, and it brings out the worst out of people and some very strange things as well internally. So, look, there's no surprise there, but the Duhi are quite bad. The Tuaregs and them, they're absolutely horrifying. All of those interviews, they've only evidenced as much. And the local African population, I think, is quite fond of the fact that the Russians are defending them about the encroachment of insane Sharia emirate building that the Janim are trying to sort of engage in. So, look, it's really, I think, just striking. I mean, notice, Conrad, the all of this moralization about Russia, that Russia is, on one hand, and this we see this among the people in the right wing on X, for example, Twitter, moralizing about Russia, that Russia is a place with a large Muslim population, extremely migrant heavy, anti-white, etc., whilst some of the most hardcore elite forces of Russia are using the exact symbols which some of these critics of Russia would be quite fond of. And that's because the Russian people, ultimately, the majority of the military are well and truly European, and they make a very, shall we say, European jokes in heated moments of battle and warfare, just like their ancestors did in the past. It's not surprising.
No, and again, who knows how much France, I'm sure France is involved, but how much they are trying to reclaim control in these Sahel states has yet to be seen. But we'll see if the Russian military is capable of replicating Prigozhin and Utkin's success. Other stories here before we get on to church news. The latest updates say around 920 confirmed dead, thousands injured in the Venezuelan earthquakes, but apparently there's tens of thousands missing. So I'd wager the death count will enter into the several thousands when this is all said and done. It was a double earthquake. One was like 7.1, another was 7.4 or something, like one after the other on coastal Venezuela. So say a prayer for the people there. The footage is pretty crazy. Entire towns and cities and coastal skylines just completely leveled. So a bit distressing to see, to say the least. So the natural disasters befalling America, South America, that's America as well. So we will be, the Philippines, all sorts of other places around the world have experienced huge earthquakes. So expect more of that, I think I would say. But another big thing that happened this past week, and I talked about this on my stream, which everyone, of course, should be tuning into Tuesday evenings, might not be happening this coming week because it is my birthday, so I might be taking the week off of the stream, or at least doing it on a different day. But this past stream was quite good, and I discussed some of the speeches at the Jerusalem News Syndicate's 2026 International Policy Summit. And one of the most interesting speeches, two of them, one of them was from Zionist lawfare activist Hillel Neuer, who blasted UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese for saying America is controlled by the Jewish lobby. He then bragged about successfully lobbying the U.S. government to sanction her and close her bank accounts for her criticism of Israel. He said she is banned from entering the United States. She can't use a bank card. She cannot use a debit card. She can't receive payment. He says after she was sanctioned, we got her husband. He was demoted from his position at the World Bank for incitement to hate. I quote tweeted this and said, "Never let anyone play dumb when it comes to the existence and power of organized world Jewry again. They openly boast at multi-million-dollar conferences about the worldwide ethnic network that systematically works to punish the enemies of both dispersed Jewry worldwide and the genocidal Jewish ethno-state in the Levant. Anyone feigning ignorance at this point is a subversive." And if you thought that was bad enough, we also saw former Hamas and Israeli intelligence member Mossad Hassan Yusuf threatening to destroy America with secret advanced weapons that Israel had kept hidden. In his speech at the JNS, he said, Israel is just playing around for now, and this is his clear message to America. If they keep pushing Israel into a corner, they will suffer the most. Israel's existence is not negotiable. It does not depend on superpowers or public opinion. So you can really only understand that as a threat to use their undeclared but widely understood nuclear program. We had some British Special Forces commander, some total goy, talking about how it's his life's goal to serve the Jewish people. So this was just, if you want to really understand the nature of the Jewish octopus, just watch all the clips from the JNS. It sort of lays it all out. No subtlety about it. It might as well have just been called the meeting of the elders of Zion or something like that, of the learned elders themselves. So that occurred this week. Do you have any thoughts on the earthquake or that or any other World War III stories from around the world this week, Dmitry, before we dive into some church news?
No, of course, the earthquake news is horrific, especially given the stress and the blockade that Venezuela has already suffered. And yeah, the government is absolutely subjugated to the US. And we know that any sort of semblance of independence that Venezuela did have prior to the kidnapping of Maduro is well and truly gone now. So it's just unfortunate. It is most likely just going to, over time, just turn into sort of a Haiti, Guyana type of situation where it's just a country in the backyard of America with no real prosperous future. And this is just one of those like natural disasters that, again, absolutely horrific. I think we recall on the show we also reacted in a similar way to the horrific northwest Syrian Turkish earthquake as well. And who knows exactly if this was entirely natural or maybe it could have been a test of certain technologies, especially given this time. I think testing such weaponry would be not necessarily. And look, it didn't hit Caracas exactly, but it did strike on the outskirts of Caracas and nearby. So it's maybe a test of sorts. Who knows? I'm not too conspiratorial about it, but I think the options are available there. And it's quite curious, of course, constantly these stories are coming up, but the mass shooting that took place in Canada and which was accompanied by quite a almost Looney Tunes type situation. And yeah, of course, innocent
Ah,
people.
yes.
I mean, this is just it's almost a caricature of reality, but in a way it reflects the modernity, where there's the Pornhub headquarters, a Talmudic rabbi walking out of the headquarters and runs in front of a female police officer who then shoots him amidst the firefight with what appears to be like a strange, some sort of, mentally ill, who knows, psyop lad who then again shot up innocent people. And all this entire thing is just completely horrific for a number of ways, but ultimately just because it reflects the absolute garbage that society has descended into recently, where it's somewhat normalized that, of course, pornographic companies run the world, that mental health is being transported to the youth of society, that, and again, in a gun-controlled country overall. So this again points to the fact that, look, they're going to take weapons from law-abiding citizens like the regular everyday Canadians, but then mentally ill people will, of course, obtain the weapons anyway and will still commit the atrocity. So again, just a sort of snapshot of what reality would look like all around the world if the globalists and members of the Talmudic tribe really had their way. I mean, it's horrific.
You really can't make this stuff up. It was an incel shooter who had left a 104-page, incel conspiratorial manifesto, who shot people up. A female officer responded and then shot Israeli Rabbi Michael Mizrahi, age 68. And again, when I saw the headline, I thought Rabbi Mizrahi, our favorite rabbi of fame, who recently called Sneeko a monkey. I thought he had, taken one for the team in this shooting. And I was like, wow. But, this one really has it all, with the rabbi, the Pornhub, the incel, the female cop. I would say Sam Hyde needs to do something with this, but it would sort of, what can you really add? It sort of just is what it is. And here we are talking about it. But sometimes, the ether tears. When I say the ether is tearing, sometimes these things occur and you're like, how did this happen? And it just burst out of the astral plane sometimes and just hits you right on the nose. But moving on, I guess, unless you have any other stories, Dmitry, this big story from Ukraine regarding the persecution, this is hopefully moves in the right direction. It says here the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's Kiev Metropolitanate has filed a lawsuit against the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, contesting the legal basis for the existence of the State Service of Ukraine for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Conscience, the body that has led government efforts to close UOC parishes, monasteries, and dioceses and dissolve the church as a whole. The lawsuit challenges the government resolutions by which the service was created and granted authority to shape and implement state religious policy, reports UOC lawyer Archpriest Nikita Chekman. The plaintiff argues that the Cabinet of Ministers gave the service powers that under the law of Ukraine on central executive bodies may belong exclusively to ministries, thereby altering the legally established distribution of authority among executive bodies in a manner the plaintiff holds to be contrary to the Constitution and laws of Ukraine. The service came to prominence in 2023 when it declared on the basis of documents from the Russian Orthodox Church that the UOC remains part of the Moscow Patriarchate. On the strength of that finding, it has since pursued the closure of the UOC dioceses, monasteries, and churches across Ukraine, and has filed a separate lawsuit seeking the dissolution of the Kiev Metropolitanate as a legal entity and the transfer of its property to the state. It is that lawsuit, along with the service's investigations, orders, and directives against the Kiev Metropolitanate, that the church cites as the direct cause of the present legal action. The Kiev Metropolitanate is acting in the court to declare the Cabinet of Ministers resolutions underpinning the service unlawful and void, and to oblige the government to dissolve the body as unlawfully established. And the same week, we see here schismatics seize Church of St. Alexander Nevsky in Odessa. Another church belonging to the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, this time in Odessa, was forcibly seized yesterday by a group affiliated with the schismatic OCU. The incident took place at the Church of St. Alexander Nevsky, part of the Odessa Diocese of the UOC. A group of men in uniforms and armed with batons blocked the entrance to the church and its gates, preventing clergy and parishioners from entering. The individuals are reported to represent a private security agency whose director is a deputy of the regional council, according to the Odessa Diocese. During the takeover, physical force was used against UOC clergy. The diocesan secretary was beaten, and one priest was knocked to the ground and choked. An ambulance was called for those injured, and a formal complaint has been filed. When UOC clergy arrived at the church, they found schismatics inside, along with a chaplain priest identified as a Father Victor, who claimed rights to the church on the basis of documents purportedly establishing a new religious community. The existing UOC parish community, which has maintained worship at the church and participated in its construction and restoration over many decades, states that no assembly was held and no vote taken to transfer to another jurisdiction. OCU cleric Teodor Orobets subsequently published video footage of the group entering the church, describing those present as the real parishioners of the church. He announced that the church would be renamed in honor of Saint Agapetus of the Kiev Caves. The OCU rejects the sanctity of Saint Alexander Nevsky because he is a beloved saint in Russia. In a separate video filmed inside the church, Orobets expressed objection to frescoes depicting the royal martyrs, Saint Andrei Bogolyubsky and Dmitry Donskoy, identified icons of Matrona of Moscow and Xenia of St. Petersburg as markers of Moscow religious life. During the standoff, one of those present snatched a prayer book from a priest's hands and damaged it, including the cover bearing an icon of the Mother of God. UOC clergy had requested permission to complete a moleben, but were refused. They were ultimately compelled to leave the premises, taking the church's holy objects with them. The building was then locked. The Odessa Diocese of the UOC condemned the seizure as unlawful and stated it intends to defend its position through legal channels. So I'd love your thoughts on the latest updates in Ukraine, Dmitry, and as well as if you have any other stories.
Yeah, this insane story of the seizing of the St. Alexander Nevsky Church in Odessa was accompanied by an insane video address by the most famous Ukrainian deacon. He's actually from the Odessa Metropolitanate. So this deacon, of course, appeared after a prayer service in, I believe it was the Odessa Transfiguration Cathedral. There's at least in the video like 10, 20 priests behind him. Maybe Metropolitan Agafangel of Odessa was present there as well. And he gave an address with a microphone to the leader of the, I believe is one of the political leaders of the Odessa region, Oleg Kiper. Oleg Kiper used to be friends of Zelensky personally, so he's Zelensky's man in Odessa. And he addressed Oleg Kiper and asking him, could you return to us the church named after Alexander? Notice he doesn't even say Saint Alexander Nevsky, because Saint Alexander Nevsky is apparently, he's an occupier saint. Despite the fact that Saint Alexander Nevsky literally lived in, what historians call Kievan Rus before the Mongol invasion and just after. His father was the Grand Duke, the Grand Prince of Kiev, Yaroslav Vsevolodovich. So, just this is completely insane. Literally, Alexander Nevsky was born and lived in what's called modern Ukraine today. And only later in life did he move to the northern provinces, to Novgorod and so forth and so on. This when Rus was entirely united and before tragedy struck with the Mongol invasion in the late 1230s, early 1240s AD. So it's completely insane, but we know there's been precedent for this insanity, Conrad, because in the past they've, of course, removed icons. And unfortunately, even I think UOC churches did this at one point. Icons of Tsar Nicholas II, OCU icons, of course, removed icons of the royal families. But even ancient saints, more or less saints from 800 years ago, like Alexander Nevsky, apparently are inappropriate because Stalin filmed a documentary film about him, or that movie that came out by Eisenstein in the 1930s. It's completely insane. And obviously, Saint Andrei Bogolyubsky lived in the 12th century, so even 100 years before Alexander Nevsky, literally no relation to the modern Russian Federation, democratic liberal state run by Vladimir Putin and United Russia, but still, it's completely insane. But there are people, unfortunately, within the canonical church who are also trying to shy away from the Russian saints. We know this because recent prayer books produced in Kiev, canonical prayer books, that try to sort of, leave out prayers to certain Russian saints. And it's unfortunate that even Fools for Christ and those famous saints like Saint Xenia of St. Petersburg are also being somewhat sidelined. It's just completely inappropriate. You cannot continue, and this address by the famous deacon from Odessa, like asking Oleg Kiper to give the Church of Alexander back without even calling it the Church of Saint Alexander Nevsky. He's ashamed to even say the word Nevsky in his address. It's just embarrassing. And look, the Talmudic regime is not going to, like, how many concessions can you get out of it, really? You're asking a beast to have mercy upon you before it slaughters you. So some more really confusing news out of Ukraine, and this comes from, I believe he's the right or the left-hand man of Metropolitan Onufry himself. So this is, of course, Archbishop Sylvester. He is the Vicar Bishop of the Kievan Metropolitan. So, of course, he, at the moment, lives and works in the city of Kiev itself. He recently addressed all of the plight of various bishops and clergy around Ukraine, because Ukraine has been literally kidnapping like 1 or 2 clergymen per week constantly. So there's priests, deacons constantly being taken and mobilized. And this is his response. This is, horrific, but this is an archbishop. So Archbishop Sylvester says, quote, "I would also like to emphasize that clergy, like other citizens of Ukraine, must comply with the requirements of the law regarding military registration and timely completion of military medical commissions. If a clergyman violates the rules of military registration, he thereby puts himself at risk, since such violations entail certain legal responsibility. Therefore, it must be clearly understood that from a legal standpoint, the territorial recruitment and social support centers have the right to mobilize any clergyman of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who is under 60 years of age and does not have a formal deferment. We must be honest here. The very fact of mobilizing such clergymen does not contradict current legislation. Mobilization rules are determined by the government. In this situation, the church can only call on priests to comply with national legislation." So Archbishop Sylvester, who is one of the top bishops of the canonical Church of Ukraine, is saying, look, if you're recruited and you're a priest and sent to the trenches, God bless, off you go. He's not expressly saying you should take a weapon and kill people, kill invading Russians, but he's basically saying the kidnapping of priests, taking them from their churches, is fine because, well, Zelensky's government deems it fine. And that's completely insane. The church and bishops, obviously the Orthodox Church, even every local church in and of itself, needs to give a moral judgment to society. It needs to correct even governmental leaders who are acting inappropriately or creating unjust laws. Simply by a law existing in and of itself does not make it just or moral or ethical in the eyes of an Orthodox Christian. It actually needs to confer with standards set out by Orthodox Christian tradition and teaching, which these laws, by mobilizing any priest or clergyman under 60, clearly that doesn't fly at all. And such a law doesn't even exist in the Russian Federation. So Archbishop Sylvester, this is the little of his pro-Zelensky sycophancy and bootlicking. I'm not even sure what else to call it, but archbishops like this need to be investigated. And of course, they probably fear a Russian liberation of Kiev as much as Zelensky does, because can you imagine Patriarch Kirill and his synod getting a hold of Archbishop Sylvester and asking him, what exactly are you trying to say here? Because this is insane. I don't even think Sergianus, at the peak of Sergianism, made statements like this in the 1930s and 40s. I'm probably exaggerating. I think they did. If you read the sermons from World War II and just before that, during the Stalinist purges, but this is quite bad. This shows you, Conrad, I think, the unfortunate case of the longer the war goes on, the more literal, for lack of a better term, mental statements we will get from representatives even of the canonical church. This is, again, we just need to pray for Archbishop Sylvester to find his mind amidst all this confusion and temptations of the modern world, because clearly this is just completely preposterous and nuts. And of course, unfortunately, really bad news is there is another anti-Christian act being prepared in Ukraine. The 140 or so monks that are still living within the Kiev-Pечерsk Lavra complex are going to be kicked out very soon. And there's even members of course, it's being pushed directly by the OCU, so the non-canonical Church of Epiphany Dumenko, but the recent, I think, anti-interceptor missile hitting the roof of the Dormition Cathedral in the Kiev caves, I think, has somewhat prompted this whole move. And now there's openly on Ukrainian television, they're talking about how appropriate it is to be kicking these pro-Russian monks out of their monastery. Like, where will these monks go to live? They'll be homeless. Again, it's completely insane. But yeah, the Ukraine is engaged in basically a cultural and religious genocide on their own territory.
Oh, it's very unfortunate. And while I can't blame the Russians for the actions of the Ukrainian state, we can blame them for allowing the Ukrainian state to exist this long and to have been empowered throughout all of this war to do all of these things. And sure, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, we can criticize them, but if the Russians had succeeded in removing this Kiev regime from power, then maybe they wouldn't have to make all of these decisions. But it's unfortunate to hear that the Archbishop is supporting the mobilization of clergy who we know are very often sent to the front with the very purpose of it's sort of an assassination, for them to die. But speaking of clergy that need to be corrected, we of course I explored this on my stream. We don't need to get into too many details, but we saw at the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine at the site of 9/11 in New York, everyone's favorite Black priest, Father Samuel Davis, led a ecumenist, nonsensical prayer group with members of the AOCC, the American Orthodox Catholic Church, which is a heterodox group of brothers who have like 4 bishops and almost no parishes, and they pretend to be Orthodox or something like that, and they, prayed together with Father Davis, and it was a whole ecumenist nonsense in honor of Juneteenth. So it was a Wakanda Black Pride type event, but that's what we all got to see. And then everyone was kind of calling this out. And Father Samuel Davis, first of all, mislabeled them as the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Church, and their Archbishop Titus, who's just a random brother. People assumed he was Antiochian, I guess, if they misread the post. And then he talked about how we're in ecumenical dialogue with them and might receive them by chrismation. And then the AOCC people were like, yeah, we're not actually going to be received by chrismation into the Greek church at all. And of course, Father Samuel Davis, I don't know the exact details. I think he at one point had a parish and no longer has it anymore because he basically failed to actually bring any Black people into Orthodoxy. Meanwhile, Father Turbo Qualls and many other parishes around the U.S. are bringing Black people in without any kind of Afrolatry and Juneteenth nonsensical race idolatry. And remember, Father Samuel Davis is not going to be disciplined for this blatant display of ecumenism and race worship. Meanwhile, remember, Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson and other people were excommunicated by Antioch and Goarch and OCA and other churches for just, organizing politically as Orthodox. They didn't do any kind of ecclesial nonsense. They didn't do any kind of, joint prayers with these people and whatnot. So very unfortunate that we see these double standards, and, the Greek bishops should step up and not allow this to happen. And I don't think Father Samuel Davis is frankly a serious person who I think he needs to be put in more of an administrative role and told to be quiet, not encouraged in this kind of race baiting, race worship nonsense, this kind of anti-white crap that he's currently a part of. So that's my perspective there. But final story, a bit of unity. As from Ortho Christian, we saw Orthodox hierarchs from across the Chicago area gathered on June 21st to welcome His Grace Bishop Spiridon of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia to his new see, meeting at the bishop's residence. Bishop Spiridon was consecrated to the episcopacy in February, initially serving as a vicar bishop of the Canadian diocese. He was subsequently elected to the Chicago see following the repose of His Eminence Archbishop Peter. And so he is now if I was in ROCOR, Bishop Spiridon would be my bishop, so Axios. The gathering brought together Archbishop Daniel of the Orthodox Church in America, Metropolitan Longin of the Serbian Church, Metropolitan Nikolai of the Romanian Church, Bishop Dionysius of the Greek Orthodox Church, and Bishop Spiridon. So some Go-Arch ROCOR unity. There was no con-celebration, but it was good to see. The meeting was held at Bishop Spiridon's invitation as he wanted to be introduced to his fellow hierarchs in the region. Discussion at the meeting included plans for cooperation among Orthodox faithful of the Chicago area and ways in which the hierarchs could support one another's work. Those present expressed the desire to continue meeting and working together. And Bishop Spiridon, very interesting. He was actually divorced in 2012, so maybe some controversy about his status there, but he immediately entered monasticism, so there's some questions there. But Axios, anyway, it's good to see we have a new bishop. I know Archbishop Gabriel was filling in for the reposed Archbishop Peter until the new election. So now Archbishop Gabriel is back in Montreal, and Archbishop Spiridon is now in charge of many ROCOR parishes in America, from Chicago all the way down to Texas through, many parts of the Midwest and other parts of America. So Axios to him. It's good to see, again, no con-celebration, but he interacted with the Greek bishop. So there's still people talking and people remaining on good terms and whatnot. So any thoughts on this and any final thoughts or news items this week, Dmitry, as we land this plane?
No, I think, cooperation between ROCOR and the Greek Church in a place like America, so far away, literally continents away from the conflict between the EP and the Moscow Patriarchate and the whole Ukrainian situation, I think it's only appropriate. Like, there's connections and ties and networking needs to stay in place. Who knows what the future of America will be jurisdictionally speaking? So many Americans are converting to Orthodoxy. So many people of different backgrounds and faiths are returning to the home of the Orthodox Church. So it's simply wonderful. And of course, Bishop Spiridon, his particular background is also very interesting because he literally comes from that Eastern European area. He grew up all the way between, like in the land of the Cossacks, between Krasnodar to Zaporozhye. He has lived all over. He most likely has been to Donetsk and Lugansk many a time, maybe been to Kherson as well. So, but that basically North Caucasus all the way to the Dnieper River. He's from that particular area before he migrated to Canada and the North Americas. So it's really an interesting figure. I think he'd be great to speak to one day, and most likely it'd be interesting to have his perspective on what it was like being like a native Russo-Ukrainian, growing up in the USSR, and his particular faith journey. I think there's a lot to speak about here. But yeah, it's been an amazing show, Conrad. So many good news here at the end. But thank you very much for covering all the intense news. And look, as always, we record on the eve of the weekend when the markets are closed, and of course, all the opportunity arises for the evil of the world to strike without losing too much of their monetary supremacy before the Monday markets open. So it's quite coincidental that the tensions are rising, especially now.
Yes, who knows? I think our analysis will hold. I believe the possibilities of escalations or returning back to negotiations, those are both very likely. Both elements exist on both sides, I believe, with, again, Marco Rubio potentially wanting to sabotage Vance and his negotiations, and certain Iranian elements in the IRGC wanting to punish Israel for their lack of cooperation in Lebanon. And this New Deal, Hezbollah has already threatened the civil war. So I think the Lebanon civil war front is going to be what we're watching the most closely going into this week. So be sure to follow us on X at @WorldWarNow_ to keep up with all of those things on that front, as well as in Russia, Ukraine, the Strait of Hormuz, Turkey, the prophecies, all of that. Follow us there to keep up with it. Follow me on X as well at GnomeRad. Follow us on Telegram at @WorldWarNowTelly. We're posting on there 24/7. It's basically a live news feed for anything that is going on. If it starts happening, it will be posted on the World War Now Telegram. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. We should have 7,000 subscribers or so by this weekend. We want to get up to 10,000 subscribers soon. So whether you're a Substack listener or a podcast listener, please subscribe on YouTube. I know you have a YouTube account and listen to things. So subscribe on YouTube. Even if you don't use YouTube, re-download the app, subscribe, and then delete it. But we need those subscriber numbers to go up. So subscribe on YouTube, like the videos, whether you're watching on Substack or elsewhere. It really helps us out. Leave a comment. We love to hear what you guys have to say about all of this. Be sure to, again, you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Leave a 5-star review. Like us there. Become a paid subscriber at worldwarnow.co. If you enjoy this analysis, want to show your appreciation, become an ether-pilled supporter on the Substack and get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes, hundreds and hundreds of hours of content, interviews with former Defense Minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, interviews with former member of the European Parliament, Nick Griffin, interviews with Father Peter Heers, Jim Jatras, David Patrick Harry, Benjamin Luigi, so many other incredible guests from all over the place, David Erhan, Jay Dyer, so many more. I mean, I could go on and on about the incredible Ether Hour content. It's, the podcast that I wish existed when I was first, getting red-pilled and becoming Orthodox and these other things. So check it all out at worldwarnow.co. If you're already a paid supporter or want to support us with a one-time payment, head on over to the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/worldwarnow. Be sure to check out antelopehillpublishing.com and use code WWN for 10% off all of your dissident book purchases. And I think that is about everything. Follow us on Instagram at @worldwarnow_. We always want to grow on there as well. We're posting more and more. So thank you all so much for making it to the very end of this episode. And Dmitry, I'll leave you with the last word.
Yes, of course. Keep Conrad and myself in your prayers. Keep the persecuted and the innocent in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe in your prayers. And we hope you'll grow in the Orthodox faith, or at least if you haven't inquired yet, now's the time to do it, especially if your country is at peace. God has given you this time, so let's invest properly in our own well-being, looking forward into the future. So thank you all for your support, and we'll see you on the next one. God bless.